works its way toward the meaning, works its way in intentionality, is the method of understanding man and the world. It studies concrete human existence, including our experience of free choice or action in concrete situations. So these are the three main types of phenomenology. Of course, there are many other different views that diverge or that branch off from these views, but in the timeline of its development, it came from realist to transcendental to existential to our modern views today that are still being developed. The first is intentionality. That's the word that we've been using so far, a word that's come up many times, and consciousness. So intentionality has to do with states of consciousness, having to do about something in a directed way. So for example, when someone is sad, they are sad about something. When you see, you are seeing something. This is an example of the being directed toward in an object. So Husserl proposed that reality could be grasped through structures of consciousness, and by applying intentionality to the object of study, or intentionally directing one's focus to describe realities. This is mainly what philosophers are interested in when it comes to the intentional object of a conscious state. It is the what it is directed towards. And this is the famous Husserl slogan that I got from an article on Merleau-Ponty. This is the quote that we've seen before. All consciousness is consciousness of something. And that's everything that I've described as before. You could say, I walk on the sidewalk. I see a boat on the dock. There is the I, and then there is the object. So we'll get another glimpse of that in being applied to the real world later on in my discussion. So the next term that is very important is consciousness. This is another key factor aspect in phenomenology. The core doctrine in phenomenology, according to Monsignor Sokolowski, this is in his words, which I also agree with. The core doctrine in phenomenology is the teaching that every act of consciousness we perform, every experience that we have is intentional. It is essentially consciousness of, or an experience of, something or other. In other words, what he's saying is that all of our awareness is directed toward objects. When I see an object. I see the chair. When I imagine being part of the communion of saints in heaven. Another example, when I walk on the carpet. And every act of this, every act of consciousness, every experience, as you will notice, correlates with an object. And I'm not saying that it's not something that we notice every day. It really has to be analyzed in the subjective view. But you'll see and you'll realize that every experience correlates with an object. It correlates with something. And that's important because it shows us that consciousness gives everything a perspective. Through it, we're able to see colors, we're able to determine size, and through consciousness, we're able to understand one another. That's essentially why it's so important. So But naturally, as we all know, objections came to phenomenological thought, as with other philosophies, that especially ones that have to do with metaphysics. And we know that there are contemporary philosophers and psychologists who wrestled with this idea of consciousness, because consciousness is something that is immaterial. A materialist who denies consciousness would think, for example, that if all people in the world did not have consciousness, then everything would still be normal and nothing would change. So that's what a materialist would say. Since they deny consciousness, and we know that that's simply not true. That can't be possible. And that's what differentiates their view from phenomenologists. Phenomenologists place consciousness at the center. So the question is, what constitutes the fundamental reality? Is it matter? Is there a thing? Is there an I? If for someone who's skeptical, or for someone who doesn't necessarily believe in a consciousness, someone who follows the materialist doctrine, they would ask, is there a being? Is there something that is beyond the physical? Because what then would constitute what's real for that person? So phenomenology reveals that when you think about the nature of reality, has a powerful relationship with how reality unfolds itself. And Merleau-Ponty, he battled against many empiricists and intellectualists, people who embrace materialist doctrine, and he has this to say in response to them. He says, both take the objective world as the object of their analysis. When this comes first, neither in time,
it's 3 o'clock,
its meaning, and both are incapable of expressing the peculiar way in which perceptual consciousness constitutes its object. Both keep their distance in relation to perception. Instead of sticking closely to it, it ends there. Both keep their distance in relation to perception, instead of sticking closely to it. So what Merleau-Ponty is saying is that if you just take on sense datum at face value, if you just analyze those material things, and there's nothing else, there's nothing more to look at, nothing more to analyze, you don't acknowledge its essence. You deny it. You don't actually search or acknowledge essence. And by doing that, you're contradicting the nature of perception, because there is an essence. So according to Merleau-Ponty, meaning exists in the object itself. And so it's different from Husserl, who said that ego transcends the object. For Merleau-Ponty, there is meaning in the object itself, and that's reality. It's not something you don't give meaning. You don't give essence. It's already there. Phenomenological applications in the church and in the world. So I talked about Merleau-Ponty earlier and his response to those materialist objections. And I also wanted to expand on a lot of his writings. He believed that the human being is an embodied being whose body manifests his way of thinking, perceiving, and being. He wrote a book called Perception of Phenomenology, and so this is where I'm getting these teachings and thoughts of his. He emphasized that we are not merely beings, but beings thrown into existence with other beings, whom we live in openness with, creating the human experience. And this to me sounds very similar to the sign from Heidegger, because he's acknowledged